Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. Character name Alex / name age 10 / age location Oakhaven, Ohio / location sex female / sex / character. My name is Alex, and when I was 10 years old, living in the quiet treeland town of Oakhaven, Ohio, my world felt pretty small, mostly confined to the yellow walls of my 4th grade classroom and the worn asphalt of the school playground. But even in that small world, problems loomed large. Problems shaped like a sneering boy named Mark, and amplified by a woman who was supposed to teach me math, but instead taught me what true unfairness felt like. A woman named Mrs. Davison. She was our math teacher, a stern woman with tight gray curls and eyes that seemed to judge you even when you were just sitting quietly at your desk. And she had a clear favorite, Mark, the kind of boy who seemed to get away with everything, the kind of boy who thrived on making others feel small. And unfortunately for me, I was often his primary target. My daily life wasn't filled with exciting adventures or carefree play like the kids in books. It was mostly about navigating the minefield of Mark's moods and Mrs. Davison's unpredictable temper, trying to stay invisible, trying to just get through the day without a confrontation. But Mark made that difficult almost impossible. He'd trip me in the hall, snatch my lunch money, whisper mean things about my clothes or my hair or anything he could think of. And Mrs. Davison, despite seeing it happen sometimes, always seemed to side with him, excusing his behavior or worse, blaming me for provoking him, saying I needed to be more resilient, whatever that meant to a 10-year-old who just wanted to be left alone. What made it even worse was Mrs. Davison's insistence that I help Mark with math. Even though she knew we were constantly at odds, it felt like a punishment, forcing me to interact with my tormentor, forcing me to be nice to someone who made my life miserable. And any time we got into it, any time I finally snapped and stood up for myself or for other kids he was picking on, Mrs. Davison would come down on me with the full force of her disapproval, treating me like dirt, making me feel like I was the problem, always me. Mrs. Davison was also deeply, openly religious, which felt strange and a little unsettling in a public school setting. She would talk about her faith often, sometimes veering into sermon-like lectures during class. And while I have my own faith, being Jewish, which is important to my family, her brand of religion felt exclusionary, judgmental, and she had a particularly hurtful way of expressing her displeasure with me. She would look at me with those judging eyes, her voice dripping with contempt, and refer to me as the devil, not in a joking way, but with serious, cold conviction, as if she genuinely believed I was somehow evil because I dared to challenge Mark or because I didn't conform to her expectations of quiet subservience. Being called the devil by my teacher, by an adult who was supposed to guide and protect me, was crushing. It burrowed deep under my skin, planting a seed of confusion and hurt. How could someone say that about a child, especially someone who was struggling, someone who was being picked on relentlessly? It made me question myself, wonder if there was something fundamentally wrong with me, if I was somehow deserving of the cruelty I faced. It was a heavy burden for a 10-year-old heart to carry, this feeling of being unfairly labeled, misunderstood, and constantly targeted. And it fueled a slow-burning sense of injustice inside me, a quiet resentment that grew with every unfair glare, every undeserved punishment. Every time I was forced to sit next to Mark and pretend to be helpful while he snickered and called me names under his breath, Mrs. Davison would watch, a small smile playing on her lips, as if she enjoyed seeing me squirm, and the injustice of it all felt like a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe sometimes. The world felt rigged against me, school felt like a battleground, and the one adult who should have been a safe harbor was instead the one actively making things worse, validating the bully and condemning the bullied. And as the days turned into weeks, the initial hurt began to curdle into something else, something harder, something less about sadness and more about a quiet, simmering anger, a growing sense that this couldn't stand, that something had to change, that I couldn't keep living like this. Always on the defensive, always feeling like the outcast, always being called the devil for simply existing and trying to survive. And this growing feeling, this potent mix of anger and despair and a fierce sense of being wronged, marked the beginning of the end of just passively enduring. Act 1 ended with that feeling, that shift from hurt to anger, that quiet resolve that things couldn't continue as they were. But Act 2 was where the real struggle began, where I tried in my 10-year-old way to navigate the worsening situation, to fight back, and found myself pushed further and further down, the stakes getting higher, the humiliation deeper. The bullying didn't stop, it intensified, maybe because Mark sensed my growing defiance, maybe because Mrs. Davison's favoritism emboldened him, but every day brought a new indignity, a new attempt to make my life miserable, and Mrs. Davison was always there, watching, sometimes intervening, but always twisting it back on me, making it seem like my fault, my reaction was the problem, not his initial aggression. The physical education class was a particular battleground. It was less structured than the classroom, more free movement, which meant more opportunities for Mark to corner me or trip me or just generally make a nuisance of himself. And the gym teacher, Mr. Harrison, was a kind man, but he couldn't be everywhere at once, and Mrs. Davison's influence seemed to extend even into the gymnasium. a silent understanding among some of the staff that Alex was a difficult child. A reputation unfairly earned through Mrs. Davison's biased reporting. One day during gym class, things escalated dramatically. We were playing some sort of dodgeball variation, and Mark, instead of focusing on the game, was focused on me, pelting me with soft dodgeballs even when I was out laughing, his face contorted with that familiar mean glee. I tried to ignore him, tried to move away, but he was relentless, following me, throwing harder, and then he started shoving, not just little shoves, but hard pushes, trying to knock me off balance. Trying to get a reaction, I remember stumbling, trying to stay on my feet, my arm in a cast from a recent fall off my bike. It was uncomfortable and itchy, and just another thing that made me feel vulnerable. And Mark seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting my injured arm. He shoved me again, harder this time, and I went down, landing awkwardly on the hard gym floor. The breath knocked out of me, it hurt, my arm throbbed inside the cast. And something inside me just snapped, all the pent-up frustration, all the unfairness, all the times I'd been called names, tripped, pushed around, blamed, it all boiled up in an instant. I scrambled to my feet, tears of pain and anger blurring my vision, and without thinking I swung my cast, not really trying to hit him, but just wanting him to stop, wanting to create distance, wanting to fight back against the constant assault. But the cast was heavy, clumsy, and my swing was wild, more a desperate flail than a deliberate attack. I wasn't trying to bludgeon him, as the Reddit post said, but in that moment of raw, unfiltered emotion, it must have looked that way, a small, hurt kid using the only weapon they had. Mr. Harrison, the gym teacher, was there in an instant, pulling us apart, his voice calm but firm, separating me and Mark, demanding to know what happened. Mark, of course, played the victim, tearfully claiming I had attacked him for no reason, and I, still shaking and tearful, tried to explain, tried to say he shoved me first, that he wouldn't leave me alone, that I was just trying to make him stop. But the sight of me swinging my cast was probably more compelling than my shaky explanation. And Mr. Harrison, while not as overtly biased as Mrs. Davison, seemed unsure of what to do. And then Mrs. Davison arrived, drawn by the commotion, her eyes immediately locking onto me, her expression hardening into that familiar look of disapproval. She didn't ask for my side of the story, didn't inquire about whether I was hurt from being shoved. She simply saw the scene, saw me with my cast raised, and the judgment was instantaneous and absolute. Aftermath was excruciating. I was taken to the principal's office, questioned, lectured, but the worst part wasn't the detention I received. It was the meeting with Mrs. Davison later that day. She pulled me aside after class, her voice low and cold, her words cutting deeper than any scrape or bruise. She didn't yell, she didn't need to. Her quiet disappointment and veiled condemnation were far more effective. She spoke about my behavior, about my aggression, about how I needed to control myself. And then, looking me directly in the eyes, she said it again, that terrible phrase that had become her weapon of choice against me. She said I was acting like the devil, that my actions were proof of a dark influence, that I needed to repent or change, or something equally vague and terrifying to a 10-year-old. It wasn't just a reprimand. It was a spiritual indictment, a declaration that I was inherently bad, inherently wrong. And hearing her say that after everything, after being bullied, after being shoved to the ground, after finally trying to defend myself, it was devastating. It felt like hitting rock bottom, not just because of the punishment or the humiliation, but because of the profound sense of injustice, of being completely alone and misunderstood, of being labeled something so terrible by someone who was supposed to be a trusted adult. All my attempts to reason, to explain, to get someone to understand what I was going through seemed futile. My parents were supportive but busy. And while they talked to the school, nothing fundamentally changed. Other teachers seemed unwilling to get involved, or maybe they just didn't see the extent of it. I felt trapped, isolated, and utterly powerless. The world felt unfair, cruel, and relentless. And in that moment of deepest despair, sitting alone in my room after the gym incident and Mrs. Davison's cruel words, the seed of resentment that had been growing finally blossomed into something sharp and focused. The idea wasn't just about surviving anymore. It wasn't about getting things back to normal. It was about evening the score, about making Mrs. Davison understand, in some small way, the kind of discomfort and distress she had so casually inflicted upon me. She called me the devil. She treated me like I was inherently bad for standing up for myself. She used her position of authority to make me feel worthless. And in that dark, lonely place at rock bottom, a daring, perhaps even mischievous, idea began to form, an idea that felt both scary and exhilarating, an idea born from desperation and a burning need for justice, or perhaps something closer to revenge. A revenge that wouldn't involve violence, but something quieter, more insidious. Something that would target her in a way that was uniquely personal to her. Something that would make her squirm, just like she had made me squirm countless times. The thought of it, even just the nascent idea, brought a strange sense of power, a feeling of taking back control in a situation where I had felt utterly powerless for so long. And in that moment, the transformation began. The hurt little kid started to fade, and someone else, someone with a plan, began to emerge, ready to prove Mrs. Davison right in the most unexpected way possible. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. Act 3 began with that transformation, that decision born from the depths of despair and injustice, the decision to stop being a victim and start being an architect of change. even if that change was fueled by revenge. Mrs. Davison had called me the devil, and in my 10-year-old mind, the way to reclaim power to strike back against her unfairness was to embody that label not by being genuinely evil, but by doing something she would perceive as deeply upsetting, something that went against everything she seemed to stand for. She was hyper-religious, openly judgmental of anything she deemed outside the bounds of her faith, and I knew exactly the kind of things that would make her skin crawl. Things she would consider frivolous, perhaps even sinful. Things like psychics, tarot card readings, medium services, all the things she would probably lump together under the umbrella of forbidden practices. The idea was simple in its core, but executing it required a kind of focused determination that surprised even me. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing, it was a project. A mission that occupied my thoughts for the next couple of weeks after the gym incident, while the dust was still settling, while the school was implementing those extra email protocols I would later hear about. Protocols put in place, I suspected. Because of the sheer volume of unwanted email Mrs. Davison suddenly started receiving, which would be my doing, my quiet, unseen revenge. I spent hours at the library after school, supposedly doing homework but secretly poring over magazines, pamphlets, anything I could find that listed psychic services, tarot readers, astrologers, anything remotely related to fortune-telling or communicating with spirits. The internet wasn't as ubiquitous then, especially for a 10-year-old with limited access, so the library was my primary source. I'd scribble down names and websites and phone numbers on scraps of paper. Feeling a thrill of secrecy and purpose with each new entry, it felt like I was gathering intelligence, building an arsenal, and with each name I added to my list, the feeling of power grew. A quiet, internal strength that countered the powerlessness I had felt for so long. I also used my home computer when my parents weren't around to search online, typing carefully into the search bar, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear of getting caught. I found countless websites offering free readings, email newsletters about daily horoscopes, promotions for psychic hotlines, anything that required an email address to sign up. The key, I realized, was getting her school email address. The one she used for everything school-related, the one she checked constantly. I knew it wasn't my email address, that it was public information on the school website listed alongside all the other teachers' contact information. A simple string of letters and numbers followed by the school's domain name. I wrote it down carefully, double-checking each letter, feeling a surge of adrenaline as I finally had the target locked. Over those 2 weeks, I compiled a lengthy list, dozens, maybe even close to 100 different services, each one representing a potential email that would land in Mrs. Davison's inbox. Each one a tiny, silent strike against her unfairness, her cruelty, her judgment. And then one afternoon, when I was sure I had enough time and privacy, I began the process of signing her up. It was tedious work going to each website, finding the sign-up form, carefully typing in Mrs. Davison's school email address, creating fake names if needed, sometimes just leaving the name blank, clicking subscribe, join, receive updates. Each click felt like dropping a tiny stone into a pond, the ripples unseen at first, but accumulating, spreading out. I imagined her face as her inbox started filling up, not with important school announcements or emails from parents, but with subject lines like "Your destiny awaits," "Connect with loved ones beyond the veil," "Free tarot reading just for you." Emails promising spiritual guidance, astrological predictions, messages from the other side, everything she would likely view as nonsense, as blasphemy, as something intrusive and deeply unwelcome. The thought of her reaction brought a grim satisfaction, a sense that I was finally turning the tables, using her own perceived vulnerabilities, her rigid beliefs against her. I didn't do it all in one go. I spread it out over a few days, a few signups here and there, whenever I had a moment alone with a computer, letting the digital tide slowly build, ensuring that the deluge felt less like a single event and more like an ongoing annoyance, a persistent digital haunting. The beauty of it was the anonymity. There was no way to trace it back to me, a 10-year-old girl in her 4th grade class, diligently doing her math homework, the perfect, innocent cover. And I never got caught, not for this, my quiet digital revenge. But I saw the effects, subtle at first, then more noticeable. I started hearing whispers among the students, overheard conversations between teachers in the hallway, talk about email issues, spam filters, and the mention of new email protocols being put in place for the teachers, more stringent filters, warnings about opening suspicious emails. It wasn't explicitly stated, but the timing felt too perfect. It seemed my little project had caused a stir, a minor administrative headache for the school staff, and knowing I was the unseen cause. The silent architect of that disruption brought a sense of profound internal satisfaction. But the revenge wasn't just about the emails, that was the catalyst. The opening move, the real ongoing revenge played out in the classroom, under Mrs. Davison's nose every single day. After the email bombing, I changed my approach with Mrs. Davison. Instead of being quiet and withdrawn, I became overly sweet, overly polite. I smiled at her whenever our eyes met, a wide, innocent smile that I hoped conveyed nothing but respectful deference. I layered on the cheese thick, answering questions enthusiastically, volunteering to help with classroom tasks, doing everything I could to present a picture of a model student, the exact opposite of the devil she had accused me of being. It was a performance, a mask, and beneath the mask, the quiet satisfaction simmered. And then there was Mark, my bully, the other piece of this tangled problem. Mrs. Davison still insisted I help him with his math, still seated us near each other, maybe as a way to keep an eye on me, maybe because she genuinely thought I could help him. But now the dynamic was different. I was still forced to interact with him. But instead of just enduring his taunts and begrudgingly helping, I saw a new opportunity, a way to extend my revenge subtly, undetectably. To the other half of the problems. When I helped Mark, I would deliberately, subtly mislead him, not obviously wrong answers, nothing that would be immediately caught, but small errors in calculation, misplaced decimal points, slightly incorrect formulas that would lead to wrong answers down the line. I would explain concepts in a confusing way, use terms incorrectly, all with a helpful, earnest expression on my face. If he asked a question, I would give him an answer that was almost right. Just enough off to make his work incorrect. It was a slow burn, a subtle sabotage. But I watched with quiet satisfaction as his grade started to dip, a failing grade here, a low score there, nothing drastic enough to raise immediate alarm bells, but a noticeable decline from his previous performance, and Mrs. Davison, ever the champion of her favorite student, seemed increasingly flustered by his struggles. She would sigh, look disappointed, sometimes even snap at him in frustration. She couldn't understand why he wasn't doing better. Why he was making careless mistakes. She probably blamed him, or maybe even blamed herself, never suspecting that the quiet, sweet girl she had labeled the devil was the unseen hand guiding his academic spiral. The combination of the email deluge and the subtle academic sabotage seemed to take a toll on Mrs. Davison. I watched her over the next few weeks. She seemed more stressed, more distracted. She would rub her temples, sigh frequently. Sometimes she would look around the classroom with a harried expression, as if she expected some further annoyance to appear out of nowhere. Her nerves seemed frayed, her usual stern demeanor replaced by a sort of brittle tension, and knowing that the little girl she had dismissed and demonized was the cause of her discomfort brought a chilling sense of triumph. It wasn't a loud, dramatic revenge. There was no grand confrontation, no moment of revelation where I confessed my actions. It was quiet, sustained, and deeply personal. It targeted their weaknesses, his academic struggles, her rigid beliefs, and perceived authority. And it unfolded slowly, day by day, email by email, subtly incorrect answer by subtly incorrect answer. The consequences for me were none. I never got caught. My grades didn't suffer. My sweet, innocent facade was impenetrable. The consequences for them were less concrete than I might have imagined in my 10-year-old fantasies. Mrs. Davison didn't lose her job, Mark didn't suddenly become a model student or apologize for his bullying. But their lives were made just a little bit harder, a little bit more frustrating, a little bit less comfortable. Their sense of control, which they had used to make my life miserable, was subtly undermined. The resolution wasn't a perfect Hollywood ending where everything was righted, but it was a change, a shift in the power dynamic. I no longer felt like the helpless victim. I had taken action, I had fought back in my own way, and I had won not a battle in the traditional sense, but a psychological war, a quiet act of defiance that restored a sense of agency, a sense that I wasn't completely powerless in their rigged world. I continued my sweet act with Mrs. Davison, watching her, learning, and I continued my subtle sabotage with Mark, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of seeing his frustration, their combined misery. A small, private victory for the girl who had been called the devil, a victory that felt earned, felt like a necessary balancing of the scales. A way of saying that you couldn't treat people like that and get away with it completely. There would be consequences, even if they didn't know where those consequences came from. Looking back now, years later, I understand the complexities of that time, the imperfect nature of my revenge, the fact that it didn't solve everything, didn't heal the hurt completely. But in that moment, as a 10-year-old who had been pushed to her limit, it was exactly what I needed, a way to reclaim my power, to strike back against injustice, to prove that even the quietest person could have a profound impact, and that sometimes the best way to deal with being unfairly labeled is to subtly, undeniably prove them right on your own terms. And that, more than anything, is the lasting lesson I took from my 4th grade year, a lesson about standing up for yourself, finding your own strength, and perhaps occasionally embracing the power of a quiet, well-executed revenge. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily.